The word hit Harriet Quinn like a branding iron pressed flat against her chest. Not the word itself exactly. It was the way the boy said it. 12-year-old Thomas Chandler stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his dusty hat crushed in both fists, his jaw set with the same iron stubbornness she had come to recognize as a Chandler family trait, and he looked her dead in the eye and said, "Ma'am, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it plain." She had been standing at the stove, stirring a pot of venison stew, and the wooden spoon went still in her hand. Behind Thomas, she could see the wide New Mexico sky going bloodshot at the edges with the last of the October sun. The year was 1882, and she had been living on the Chandler Ranch for exactly 47 days. "Then say it plain," she told him. Thomas swallowed. His younger brother, 8-year-old Eli, appeared at his elbow like a shadow, and both boys stared at her with those devastating blue eyes they had inherited from their father. Charles Chandler had those same eyes. Eyes that felt like they could see every secret she had ever buried. "We heard you crying last night," Thomas said. "Through the wall." The wooden spoon started moving again. She needed it to move. "Walls in old houses carry sound," she said. "Ma'am," Thomas took one step into the kitchen. "We heard you say you made a terrible mistake coming here, that nobody wants you, that you should have stayed in Philadelphia." The silence that followed was the kind that could swallow a person whole. The stew bubbled once, twice. Outside, a horse stamped its foot against the hard October earth. Harriet's throat tightened with something she refused to call grief, because grief implied loss, and she had to keep telling herself that she had not yet lost anything. She had simply not yet gained what she had hoped for. The truth was sharp and unforgiving. She had answered an advertisement placed in a Philadelphia newspaper in the summer of 1882. A New Mexico rancher, the notice had read, seeks a woman of good character and practical skills to serve as housekeeper and governess to 2 sons, aged 12 and 8. The position offers room, board, and fair wages. Serious inquiries only. The name signed at the bottom had been C. Chandler. She had arrived at the Chandler Ranch expecting a man who needed a housekeeper. What she had found was a fortress. Charles Chandler was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and silence, and a grief so old and deep it had calcified into something almost impenetrable. His wife, Eleanor, had died of fever 4 years before Harriet arrived. He spoke of her the way people speak of mountains, as though she was simply part of the landscape, immovable and eternal and impossible to compete with. He had not been unkind to Harriet. That was the cruelest part. He had been perfectly, glacially polite. He said good morning. He said thank you for dinner. He held the door. He was a good man in the way that a locked box is a good box. Sturdy, well-made, and completely sealed. And his sons, his beloved boys, had called her ma'am from the first moment they met her, and had not stopped since, and she had told herself it was fine, it was appropriate, it was how things were done in proper households. But 47 days in, alone in her narrow room while the New Mexico wind pressed itself against the window glass, she had finally let herself feel what she had been denying since she stepped off the stagecoach in Cimarron. She felt unwanted. She felt invisible. She felt like a ghost haunting a house that already had all the ghosts it needed, and 2 small boys had heard her say so through a wall. Thomas lifted his chin. "My father does not know you cried," he said. "He is out checking the east fence. He will not be back until supper." "I know his schedule," Harriet said quietly. "He is not easy," Thomas said. "I know that. I'm not going to tell you that he is easy because I am 12 and I know the difference between truth and a lie, and he is not easy." Something about the boy's directness made her eyes sting. She set the spoon on the edge of the pot. She turned around and looked at him properly, the way she had been careful not to look at either of the boys too directly, because looking at them properly made her want things she was not sure she was entitled to want. "No," she agreed. "He is not easy." "But he is not a bad man," Eli said from behind his brother's shoulder. His voice was smaller, softer, missing one of his front teeth so that his words came with a slight whistle. "He used to laugh, before." Before that word again, before Eleanor died, before the world came apart, before. I know he is not a bad man, Harriet said. Thomas took another step into the kitchen. He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands, and then he looked up at her with an expression so adult and so unguarded that it broke something loose in her chest. "Ma'am," he said, and then he stopped. He started again. "Ma'am, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honest." "All right." "Are you going to leave?" The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. Harriet felt the rings of it spreading outward through every part of her. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about the small apartment she had shared with her sister before her sister married. She thought about the newspaper advertisement and the weeks of correspondence and the train ride and the stagecoach ride, and the first sight of the Chandler Ranch sitting against the Cimarron Range like something from a dream that was also a little bit of a warning. "I have not decided," she said, because that was the truth. Thomas nodded slowly, like a man receiving a fair verdict. "Okay," he said. "Then I want to ask you one more thing." "Ask." He met her eyes. "Would you mind if we called you by your first name? Not ma'am, your name, the one that belongs to you." The stew bubbled. The horse outside stamped again. Harriet Quinn felt the tears she had already spent the night on threatening to make a second appearance, and she absolutely refused to let them. "My name is Harriet," she said. "Harriet," Thomas said. He said it carefully, like he was learning the weight of it, like names were things to be handled with respect once they were given. "Harriet," Eli echoed, and he smiled the gap-toothed smile of an 8-year-old who had just been given permission for something important. And that was the moment. That small, quiet, devastating moment in a kitchen in New Mexico in 1882 when two boys asked a woman for her name. It was the moment Harriet Quinn decided, without fully understanding why, that she was not going to leave. Not yet. Possibly not ever. She did not yet know what that decision was going to cost her. She did not yet know about the dark past that Charles Chandler kept locked in the room at the end of the hall. She did not yet know about the man who would ride into Cimarron in November with secrets that could unravel everything. And she did not yet know that the heart of a man who had forgotten how to open itself could, with the right kind of patience and the right kind of fire, open again. But she was about to find out. She turned back to the stove and picked up the spoon. "Go wash up," she told the boys. "Supper will be ready when your father gets in." Thomas put his hat back on his head. He was almost to the door when he turned back around. "Harriet," he said, testing the name one more time, like a key in a lock. "Thank you." She nodded and kept stirring, and the wind pressed against the window, and the October sky bled out to purple and black. And somewhere out on the east fence line, a man who had forgotten how to come back from grief was riding home to a supper he did not know was being prepared by someone who had, in the space of one quiet conversation with his children, decided to stay. 3 months earlier, on a suffocating July afternoon in Philadelphia, Harriet Quinn had been sitting at a table in her sister's narrow kitchen reading the classified section of the newspaper, with the focused desperation of a woman who knows her time in her current situation is running out. Her sister Ruth had married well, or at least married a man who made a reasonable living as a clerk, and the apartment above the haberdashery on Chestnut Street had been Harriet's home since their father died 2 years prior. But Ruth was expecting her first child by Christmas, and the apartment had 2 rooms, and the kindness of family has its natural limits when space is short and money is tight, and everyone is trying not to say the thing they are all thinking. Harriet was 28 years old. She was not married. In Philadelphia in 1882, those two facts together constituted a kind of quiet social catastrophe that polite people did not discuss directly, but that everyone understood perfectly well. She had prospects, technically. A schoolteacher named Gerald Winslow had been calling on her for the better part of a year with all the romantic urgency of a man deciding which shoes to purchase. He would eventually offer her something, she supposed. A life of adequate comfort, adequate companionship, adequate everything. She had looked at that future, turned it over in her hands like an object she was considering buying, and set it back down. She wanted something real. She wanted something that felt like it mattered. She was not entirely sure she knew what that looked like yet, but she was certain it did not look like Gerald Winslow eating toast in a small kitchen on Chestnut Street for the next 40 years. The advertisement in the newspaper was the third one down in the domestic positions column. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. New Mexico, 2 boys, a rancher. Her heart did something uncomfortable and inexplicable that she chose to interpret as practical interest rather than the sudden flaring of hope, because hope was a dangerous thing, and she had learned to be careful with it. She wrote back that same evening. The exchange of letters took 3 weeks in total. Charles Chandler's letters were brief, precise, and entirely free of any unnecessary warmth. He outlined the requirements of the position with the thoroughness of a man who had been disappointed before, and intended to be specific enough that disappointment could not ambush him again. She would be responsible for the household management and the boys' lessons. She would have Sundays to herself. The wages were $8 a month plus room and board. The work was not easy. New Mexico was not Philadelphia. She wrote back and said she understood all of that and she was interested. His final letter before she booked her passage said only, "Miss Quinn, if you are decided, the stage from Santa Fe to Cimarron runs on Tuesdays. I will arrange to meet it. Respectfully, C. Chandler." She told Ruth about the plan over a supper of bread and cold ham, watching her sister's face go through several distinct phases of concern, resignation, and finally, a kind of exhausted acceptance that was really just love with nowhere else to go. "New Mexico," Ruth said. "New Mexico. Do you know anything about it?" "I know it is west of Texas and that it is not yet a state," Harriet said. "And I know that I need something to do that is not sitting in this apartment reading newspapers until Gerald Winslow decides to make up his mind." Ruth reached across the table and took her hand. "Write to me," she said. "Every week," Harriet promised. She arrived in Cimarron on a Tuesday in late August, stepping off the stagecoach into a blast of dry heat that felt like being pressed between 2 warm irons. The town was smaller than she had imagined, though it had grown substantially in recent years with the range wars and the cattle trade that ran through Colfax County. There was a main street with a hotel, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a post office. Beyond the rooftops, the land spread out vast and golden toward mountains that looked like they had been drawn by someone who had never seen real mountains and was working from a description. She was looking around for a man who matched the picture her imagination had assembled from 3 weeks of letters when she heard boots on the wooden boardwalk and turned to find Charles Chandler standing 6 feet away from her. He was taller than she had expected. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a conventional way once, before years of sun and wind and hard living had restructured it into something more interesting and more severe. His jaw was clean-shaved, his hat was pushed back off his forehead, and he was looking at her with an expression that was completely unreadable. "Miss Quinn," he said. Not a question, a recognition. "Mr. Chandler," she said. He picked up her trunk without asking if she needed help, loaded it into the back of a wagon, and helped her up onto the seat with one brief, impersonal hand under her elbow. Then he climbed up beside her and put the horses to a walk. "It is about 9 miles to the ranch," he said. "All right," she said. They drove 7 of those 9 miles in a silence so complete it had its own texture. She looked at the land. She looked at the sky. She looked at him once from the side at the set of his jaw and the way his hands held the reins, easy and unhurried, like a man who had made peace with the pace of things. He looked straight ahead. "The boys are Thomas and Eli," he said eventually. "Yes, you mentioned them in your letters. Thomas is the older one. He has ideas about being the man of the house. I have told him he is not yet old enough for that job, but he disagrees." Something shifted briefly in his face. Not quite a smile. "The ghost of something. He will argue with you about your teaching methods. Don't let him win." "I won't," she said. Another mile passed. The mountains got no closer, which was one of the peculiar tricks of the New Mexico distances. "Mrs. Chandler passed 4 years ago," he said. "I mention it so you are not surprised if the boys speak of her." "I'm sorry," Harriet said. He nodded once, a small, precise movement, and did not say anything more about it for the remaining 2 miles. The ranch itself was more substantial than she had imagined. The house was a long adobe structure with deep-set windows and a porch that ran the full length of the front. There was a barn, a corral with 4 horses, a kitchen garden that was clearly being tended with care, and a windmill turning lazily against the hot sky. It had the look of a place that had been built and added to over years, each addition made with the same deliberate, unhurried craft as the original. The 2 boys were standing on the porch when the wagon pulled in. Thomas had arranged himself with an air of careful composure that made him look absurdly like a small version of his father. Eli was standing on 1 foot, apparently for no reason. "Boys," Charles said as he helped Harriet down. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Thomas said precisely. "Ma'am," Eli echoed, putting his 2nd foot down. "Ma'am." And so it began. The first weeks were an education in a number of things simultaneously. She learned the patterns of the household, which were austere and efficient and clearly designed by someone who valued function over comfort. She learned the boys' particular shapes of intelligence, Thomas's relentless logical mind, and Eli's extraordinary gift for drawing things he saw, animals and clouds and the faces of people, done in secret in a journal he thought she didn't know about. She learned the particular angle of the New Mexico light at each hour of the day, which was different from any light she had ever seen, more unsparing and more beautiful. She learned, over many suppers eaten in that correct and careful quiet, that Charles Chandler was not indifferent to the world around him. He was not cold. He was sealed. There was an enormous difference, though it took her a while to see it. Sealed meant there was something on the inside. Sealed meant the lock existed because something worth protecting was behind it. She learned that he woke before dawn and worked until full dark, and that he ran his ranch the way he ran his household, with discipline and care, and a pride that was not boastful but was deep and unshakable. She learned that he read books, and that 3 of the shelves in the sitting room were his, and that he had read the complete works of Charles Dickens twice, which she found so unexpected and so charming that she had to go back to the kitchen and stand very still for a moment to collect herself. She learned that he was afraid of losing things. She could see it in the way he watched the boys, not hovering, not anxious, but with a constant, quiet attention that never fully switched off. He knew where his sons were at all times without seeming to try. He knew when Thomas was upset before Thomas showed it. He knew when Eli had a bad dream before Eli said anything. He was a man built for love in the way that certain tools are built for specific and delicate purposes, and the love he bore his children was the only part of him she could see clearly. The rest was locked. By late September, the locked parts had begun to drive her to a quiet distraction she kept entirely to herself. She told herself it was unprofessional. She told herself she was here to keep house and teach arithmetic, not to go assembling feelings about employers who had given her no indication of anything beyond polite appreciation for well-cooked meals. She told herself all of this very firmly and very regularly, and it didn't help in the slightest. She kept her distance. She was professional. She was warm with the boys and correct with their father. She managed the household with steady competence, and she taught Thomas and Eli their lessons every morning at the table in the sitting room while Charles worked the land, and she wrote letters to Ruth every Sunday evening, and she told herself she was content. She was not content. And then October came, and one night the wind was particularly bad and the house felt particularly small, and the locked room at the end of the hall seemed particularly present in the way that secrets always make themselves felt. And she lay in her narrow bed and said, out loud to no one, that she had made a terrible mistake, and that nobody wanted her here and that she should have stayed in Philadelphia. And 2 small boys heard her through the wall, and one of them asked for her name. In the days following the kitchen conversation, something shifted. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was more like the way the temperature changes when a season decides to turn. Not a single cold day, but a gradual rearrangement of the air so that one morning you go outside and realize that summer is gone and something else has arrived. Thomas and Eli called her Harriet. Not Harriet, ma'am, not Miss Harriet. Simply Harriet, the way people say the name of someone they trust. And with the name came things that had not been there before. Thomas started asking her questions that went beyond the lessons, questions about Philadelphia and about what cities were like, and whether she had ever been to the ocean, which she had once as a child. And she told them about it at supper one evening, describing the sound and the smell and the particular gray-green color of the Atlantic on an overcast day. And Eli made her draw the shape of a wave on a piece of paper so he could study it, because he had never seen one. Charles Chandler listened to all of this from the far end of the table, without appearing to listen. She was learning to read the geography of his attention, the slight tilt of his head, the way his coffee cup stayed untouched for longer than usual when something she said had caught and held him. He was listening. He was always listening. He just had not yet found a way to let her know that he was. The shift accelerated on a Saturday morning in early November when she rode into Cimarron with Charles for the weekly supply run. This was a practical necessity that they had navigated for 2 months with an efficiency that left very little room for anything other than the list of goods required. But on this particular Saturday, a man was waiting at the general store. His name was Frank Delaney, and Harriet recognized him before Charles had even fully drawn the wagon to a stop, which was a problem, because she had hoped very much that Frank Delaney was not the kind of man who would follow a woman to New Mexico. He was leaning against the front of Morrison's general store with his hat tipped forward and his boots crossed at the ankle, and when the wagon pulled in he pushed the hat back and looked at Harriet with a smile that had nothing warm in it. He was 35, dark-haired and handsome in a way that was immediately suspicious if you had ever seen him in a dim room after too much whiskey, which Harriet had, once, in Philadelphia, at a party at which she had been introduced to him by a mutual acquaintance, and at which he had behaved in a manner that she had reported to no one, because in 1882 women who reported things were often made to feel that the thing they were reporting was somehow their fault. "Miss Quinn," Frank Delaney said pleasantly, like they were old friends. Charles was down from the wagon by then, and she felt him go still beside her, not tense exactly, but sharply attentive, the way a man goes still when he senses that a situation contains information he does not yet have. "Mr. Delaney," she said, keeping her voice flat and even, "this is a surprise." "I imagine it is," he said. He was still smiling. "Long way from Philadelphia." "It is," she agreed. He stepped off the boardwalk and Harriet felt herself resist the impulse to step back, because she was not going to give him that. She stood her ground. She was always standing her ground. The problem was that standing your ground cost something every time, and she had been standing it for a long time. "And who might you be?" Charles said, not loudly, not aggressively. Just a question from a man who would like an answer. Delaney looked at him with the calibrated assessment of a man who makes quick judgments about what other people are likely to do. "Frank Delaney," he said, "an old acquaintance of Miss Quinn's. I was passing through and saw her from the street. Remarkable coincidence." It was not a coincidence, and everyone standing there knew it. You did not pass through Cimarron, New Mexico in 1882 unless Cimarron was where you were going. It was 40 miles from the nearest rail line and sat at the foot of mountains that made casual passage unlikely. Frank Delaney had come to find her specifically, and the reason for that visit was a secret she had been carrying since Philadelphia, one that she had not told Charles Chandler, one that she had told herself was irrelevant to her new life and her new position and her new beginning. The secret was this: Frank Delaney was not just an unpleasant man she had met at a party. He was the man who had been courting Ruth, her sister, in the months before Ruth married her husband. He had left Ruth without explanation, under circumstances that had hurt Ruth badly, and he had left behind a debt of a different kind, a debt that involved money he had borrowed from their father and never repaid, money that their father had never recovered because he died before he could recover it, and which Harriet had written a letter about to Delaney's last known address in Boston. A letter that was apparently direct enough in its accusation to prompt him to travel 2,000 miles to address it in person. She had been a fool to write the letter. She had written it in grief after her father died, and she had not thought through the consequences because grief does not always leave room for thinking things through. "That is some coincidence," Charles said, still in that same quiet, level voice. "Indeed," Delaney tipped his hat. "Miss Quinn, I wonder if we might have a moment to catch up." "No," she said, a beat. Delaney's smile thinned slightly. "No, I am busy this morning, Mr. Delaney." She turned to Charles. "Shall we get the supply list done?" Something moved across Charles Chandler's face that she could not fully read, but it was not skepticism directed at her. It was directed at Delaney, a careful, measuring look that said everything without saying anything at all. He put a hand very briefly at the small of her back, barely a touch, here and gone, and said, "Whenever you are ready," and turned and held the door to Morrison's open for her. They got the supplies. Delaney did not follow them inside, but she could see him through the window still standing across the street when they came out, and she could see that he had gone to the saloon by the time Charles had the wagon loaded. She did not speak on the ride back to the ranch. Charles did not speak either, but the quality of his silence had changed. It was no longer the sealed silence of a man who is simply elsewhere. It was the focused silence of a man who is thinking about something specific and has not yet decided whether to speak. 3 miles out of Cimarron he spoke. "You know him," he said, not an accusation, just the recognition that facts existed. "Yes. He troubles you." She looked at the road. "He is a man from my past who I did not expect to see again." "Did he harm you?" The directness of the question surprised her. She looked at Charles Chandler's profile, at the jaw and the set of the eyes and the hands on the reins, and she measured the question against the man asking it and decided on honesty. "Not directly," she said. "He harmed people I love, and I made the mistake of writing him an angry letter about it." A muscle moved in his jaw. "And now he has come here because of the letter." "I believe so. What does he want?" "I suspect he wants me to stop being a person who might make his life inconvenient." Another long silence. The mountains were blue at this hour, the light having gone soft and lateral. She watched a hawk describe a slow circle above the chamisa-covered hills. "You should have told me," Charles said quietly. She felt the words settle into her like a reproach she deserved. "Yes," she said, "I should have. I run a ranch with 2 boys and 1 hired hand, and I cannot protect what I don't know needs protecting." The word protect hit her somewhere tender. She turned to look at him fully, taking in the hard and honest and uncomplicatedly protective expression on his face, and she felt something she had been holding in her chest for weeks loosen slightly, like a knot losing just 1 degree of tension. "I will tell you about it," she said. "All of it. This evening, if you are willing to hear it." He looked at her then. Just for a moment, just long enough for the blue of his eyes to land on her with the full weight of his attention, which was, she was discovering, a considerable weight. "I am willing," he said. That evening, after the boys were in bed and the dishes were cleared, and the oil lamp on the kitchen table had been turned up against the October dark, Harriet Quinn told Charles Chandler the truth about Frank Delaney. She told him about her father's money and the debt, and the letter she had written, and the particular kind of man Delaney was. A man who operated in the spaces between what could be proven and what could only be suspected. A man who used charm and social standing like tools, and who did not respond well to being held accountable. Charles listened to all of it without interrupting, his coffee cup warm between his hands, his eyes on her face with that focused, unhurried quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He cannot touch you here," he said. "This is my land and you are my household's employ, and in this county my word carries weight. He has no legal claim on you." "He doesn't need a legal claim," she said. He needs only to be enough of a nuisance that I feel I have to leave." "Then don't leave," Charles said. She looked at him. The lamp threw a warm and wavering light between them. He had said it simply, as though the solution were simple, and perhaps for him it was, because he was a man rooted in this place in a way she was only beginning to understand, a man for whom standing your ground was not a choice but a fact of character. "I told your sons I had not decided," she said, "about whether to stay." Something moved behind his eyes. "I know," he said. "Thomas told me." Of course he had. She almost smiled. "What did you tell him?" she asked. Charles Chandler looked at his coffee cup for a long moment, and then he looked up at her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not yet seen on him, as though the lock had shifted by exactly 1 degree. "I told him," he said slowly, "that the decision was yours and that it was a fair decision to take time with. And then I went out to the barn and I stood there for quite a while thinking about the fact that I have not told you, in all these weeks, that you are doing an extraordinary job, and that the boys are better for having you here, and that I would be sorry if you went." The lamp flame moved in some invisible current of air. Outside, the night was still and enormous in the way New Mexico nights are still, as though the whole enormous dark sky is holding its breath. "That is more than you have said to me in 47 days combined," she said. He had the grace to look briefly ashamed. "I am aware of that," he said. "Why?" she asked, not accusingly, just honestly. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because the last time I let myself get used to someone being here, she died, and I have not found a way to be casual about that risk." The words landed in the room like something laid down very carefully. She did not rush to respond to them. She let them sit between them on the table in the lamplight, the way truths need to sit sometimes before they can be handled. "I am not asking you to be casual about it," she said finally. "I am only asking you not to be a wall." He looked at her with those devastating blue eyes. "That is what Thomas says," he said, and there was something in his voice now that was warm, specifically and unmistakably warm, and she thought that was possibly the most encouraging thing she had heard since she arrived. She went to bed that night with her heart doing something complicated and entirely unmanageable, and she lay in her narrow room and listened to the New Mexico night, and she did not cry this time. Frank Delaney reappeared in Cimarron 3 days later, and this time he was more direct. He sent a note to the ranch via the post, addressed to Harriet, which Charles handed to her at breakfast without comment, but with an expression that was very carefully neutral in the way that careful neutrality is always masking something else. She read it at the table. The note said that he had some letters from her that she might want returned. Letters that contained certain accusations that a woman in a precarious social position, meaning employed at a widower's ranch far from her family and connections, might not want to become public. He suggested that a conversation between them in Cimarron at her earliest convenience would be mutually beneficial. It was a threat. It was a neat and cowardly threat dressed up in the language of reasonableness, and she recognized it for exactly what it was. She set the note on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Charles. "He has copies of my letters," she said. "He intends to use them as leverage." Charles picked up the note and read it himself, his jaw set. He put the note down. "What do the letters say?" he asked. "They say exactly what I told you they say. That he borrowed money from my father under false pretenses and never repaid it, and that I believed him to be a cowardly and dishonest man." She paused. "They say it in considerably more colorful terms. I was grieving." A sound came out of Charles Chandler that she realized after a moment was a laugh. It was brief, and she did not think he intended it, and he controlled it quickly, but it had been real, and she felt it settle into her chest with the warmth of something she wanted more of. "I am going to speak to Sheriff Walters," he said. "Delaney has no legal ground to stand on, and I want Walters to know he is in the area. Men like that do better when they know they are being watched." "You don't have to involve yourself in this," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I believe I explained that," he said. She did not argue. He rode into Cimarron that morning, and she taught Thomas and Eli their lessons, mathematics for Thomas and reading for Eli, who was sounding out sentences in a primer with the ferocious concentration he brought to everything he cared about. Between exercises, she watched Eli's journal, which he had finally let her see, filled with his drawings, horses and hawks and the particular shape of the mountains from the front porch, and several careful portraits of faces she recognized. His father, his brother, and one of her, done in pencil, which caught her likeness with an accuracy that startled her. He had drawn her at the stove. She was laughing at something, her head tilted, her hair coming loose from its pins. "This is very good," she told him, genuinely. Eli beamed the gap-toothed smile. "Thomas says it is not a practical skill," he said. "Thomas is wrong about that," she said. "Drawing what you see is how you learn to see it, and seeing clearly is the most practical skill there is." Thomas looked up from his mathematics with the expression of a boy who is considering an argument and deciding it is not worth having. "That is actually a reasonable point," he allowed. She laughed and he almost smiled, which was as close to mutual delight as Thomas Chandler was currently willing to go, and she thought again, as she thought several times a day now, that she was not going to leave. She was absolutely certain of it in a way she could not yet fully explain, and was not yet ready to examine too closely, because examining it too closely would require her to look at Charles Chandler's face in lamplight, and the way he said the word stay as though it were a simple and inevitable thing. And she was not ready to do that with full honesty, yet without her heart making demands she was not sure she was entitled to make. Charles came back from Cimarron at midday with Sheriff Tom Walters' word that Walters had spoken to Delaney and made clear that harassment of a local household employee was not something the county would tolerate. Delaney had apparently received this information pleasantly and given no indication of his intentions either way, which Charles reported with the flat factual tone of a man who has done what can be done and is now watching the next development. "He will leave or he will escalate," Charles said. "Men like that do one or the other." "And if he escalates?" Harriet asked. "Then we deal with it," Charles said, and we landed in the room like a promise. Delaney left Cimarron on a Thursday. She found out from a note sent by Sheriff Walters saying that Delaney had purchased a stage ticket south toward Santa Fe and was observed boarding the stage that morning. Whether he would stay gone was not guaranteed, but he was gone for now, and Harriet allowed herself the full relief of that, which was considerable. That evening at supper Charles told the boys that a difficulty had been resolved and that things would be calmer now. Thomas nodded with the gravity of a boy who had been aware that something was happening and had been waiting for the official report. Eli asked if he could have a second biscuit. Charles said yes. Harriet passed the biscuits, and the supper proceeded with a warmth that was, she realized, becoming ordinary, gloriously, quietly ordinary. It was Thomas who started it, as Thomas usually started things. "Harriet," he said in the same careful, deliberate way he had first said her name in the kitchen. "Yes," she said. "Are you going to stay permanently?" The table went quiet. Eli stopped chewing his biscuit. Charles set down his fork. "Thomas," Charles said. "It is a reasonable question," Thomas said, not backing down, because backing down was not in his nature. "She is good at the lessons and she does not let me win arguments, and the house is better, and Eli has started talking more." "That is because she listens," Eli said matter-of-factly, which was a very perceptive thing for an 8-year-old to say, and it landed in the room with the unintended weight of a truth spoken by someone too young to know they are being unsparing. Charles looked at Harriet. Harriet looked at Charles. The lamp was between them and the night was coming in at the windows, and she thought she could hear her own heartbeat, which was embarrassing and probably irrational but was nonetheless occurring. "I think," she said carefully, looking at both boys, "that is a question for your father and me to discuss in due course." Thomas considered this. "In due course meaning soon." "Thomas," Charles said, with slightly more weight this time. "All right," Thomas said, picking his fork back up. "I am just noting that the ranch runs better when the right things are in place." "You sound like a foreman," Charles said. "I have always said he would make a good foreman," Harriet said, and Thomas looked immensely pleased by this, and Eli laughed, and Charles looked at her across the table and smiled, a real smile this time, and it rearranged his face into something that made her fingers tighten slightly on her water glass. That smile was new. She catalogued it. November deepened into a cold that was dry and clean and smelled of pine from the mountains. She added a second blanket to her narrow bed. The mornings came gray and bright, and the days were shorter now, and they spent more time indoors, which meant more evenings at the long table in the sitting room. Eli drawing, Thomas reading, Harriet working on the mending or the household accounts, and Charles reading Dickens or reviewing the ranch ledger. And the four of them occupied that space with a quality of ease that had arrived without ceremony and without announcement, the way good things often do. She noticed things in those evenings, small things. The way Charles would occasionally glance up from his book to look at her briefly, and look back down before she could fully meet his eyes. The way he brought her coffee without being asked when the temperature dropped. The way he deferred to her on questions about the boys with a naturalness that suggested he had stopped thinking of her as the help somewhere along the way and had started thinking of her as something else, something he was not yet ready to name. She was doing the same thing. She was very aware she was doing the same thing. One evening in mid-November, she was at the kitchen table after the boys had gone to bed, writing her weekly letter to Ruth, when Charles came in from outside with the cold of the night still on his coat. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one beside her hand and sat down across the table. She finished her sentence and looked up. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was looking at the table between them, not at her, in the way he looked when he was marshaling something that was difficult for him to put in sequence. She had learned to wait this out. He was a man who needed room to get from one end of a thought to the other. "I was not kind to Alina," he said. "Not unkind, not the way Delaney is unkind, but I was not." He paused. "She was a good woman and she needed things from me, and I was often too busy or too tired or too caught up in the ranch to give them. And she died before I had fully understood that, and I have carried that for 4 years." Harriet sat very still. "I am telling you this," he said, "because I have noticed something happening in this house. Something that I want to be honest about, rather than let go on unspoken until it either resolves itself or damages something, because the latter is what I know how to let happen, and I do not want to do that again." She set her pen down. "I have noticed," he said carefully, "that I think about you. A considerable amount. I notice when you are in a room and when you are not, and I notice that the second condition is considerably less preferable to me than the first. I notice that the sound of you laughing in the other room is my favorite thing to hear on any given day, which I find ridiculous and which I have tried to argue myself out of, and which I have completely failed to argue myself out of." The lamp held very still between them. "I am aware," he continued, with the tone of a man making a legal declaration, "that this is a complicated situation. I am your employer and you are here in a professional capacity, and there is a power in that arrangement that I have no interest in abusing. So I am not telling you this as a man who expects something from you. I am telling you this as a man who is trying to be, for once in my life, honest before it is too late to be honest." She waited to be sure he was done. He appeared to be done. "Charles," she said. He looked up at his name, and she saw him register that she had used it, his first name, not Mr. Chandler, and the recognition of it moved across his face like light moving across water. "I have been not telling myself certain things since approximately the 3rd week I was here," she said. "I have been very diligent about not telling myself. I have made excellent arguments to myself about professionalism and practicality and the wisdom of not making assumptions about a man who has given me no reason to assume anything." "I have given you very little reason," he said. "No," she agreed. "You have been remarkably unhelpful," but she was almost smiling as she said it. "However, the thing I have been not telling myself is that I think about you also, considerably." and that the sound of you moving around the house in the morning before I am up is the thing I most look forward to on any given day, which I have also found ridiculous and also failed to argue myself out of. The silence that followed was the best kind of silence, full and warm and containing something that had been growing in the dark and had just stepped into the light. "I do not know what we do with this," Charles said. "I have not done this in a long time. I am not certain I was ever particularly good at it." "I am a teacher," she said. "I have some experience with people who struggle with new material." He laughed again, the same brief, real laugh she had heard once before, but this time he let it stay longer, and she let herself look at it fully. The way his whole face changed when he laughed, the way the years of severity fell back and something younger and warmer came through. And she thought she had never in her life wanted anything as straightforwardly and urgently as she wanted to see that face laugh regularly for a very long time. "Harriet," he said, and his voice had changed completely when he said her name, no longer careful, no longer measured, just her name as though it meant exactly what it sounded like. "I would very much like to court you properly, if that is something you would consider." She looked at him across the lamp and the kitchen table and the weeks of careful distance they had both been maintaining, and she felt the last of what she had been holding loosen entirely. "Yes," she said, "that is something I would consider." What followed was a courtship conducted with a thoroughness and a sincerity that Harriet found she could not have invented if she had tried, because she had not thought a man like Charles Chandler was real. She had thought he was the kind of man you read about in novels that were slightly too sentimental for real life. She had not known that he was a man who would, once he decided to do something, do it completely. He brought her wildflowers from the mesa, the late-season ones, yellow and rust-colored, and left them on the kitchen table without ceremony, as though it were simply a fact that needed recording. He asked her about Philadelphia, about her father, about her childhood, and he listened to all of it with the full weight of his attention and asked questions that showed he had been listening. He told her about his own childhood, one of 6 children on a Missouri farm, the long journey west at 22 with $30, and a plan held together mostly by stubbornness, the years of working other men's land before he had enough to claim his own. He told her about Alina. He did this with the care of a man who understands that the dead deserve to be spoken of honestly, and that honesty about the dead serves the living better than idealization. Alina had been kind and patient and had deserved better than she got in some respects, and he had loved her, and he had not always shown it, and she was gone, and he had made peace with that in the way you make peace with things you cannot change, which is not the same as being over it, but was not the same as being buried in it either. Harriet told him about Gerald Winslow. Charles listened to this with an expression of barely contained skepticism. "He sounds like a man who cannot make decisions," he said. "That is precisely what he was," she agreed. "I cannot imagine," Charles said, "looking at you across a table for a year and not knowing what decision to make." She felt warmth rise from somewhere deep in her chest. "That is a remarkable thing to say," she managed. "I said I was not good at this," he said. "I did not say I was completely incapable of it." Thomas, who had apparently been waiting for adults to behave sensibly for quite some time, received the news of his father's courtship of Harriet with the quiet satisfaction of a boy who is not surprised but is pleased to have been right. He did not make a production of it. He simply began to treat her as a permanent feature of the household with even greater conviction than before, deferring to her on domestic questions, consulting her about his lessons with the directness of someone who expects their advice to be relevant to their future, and occasionally appearing at her side when something needed carrying, with a proprietary helpfulness that she found deeply endearing. Eli received the news by climbing into Charles's lap after supper one evening, which he was technically old enough to not be doing, and asking very seriously whether Harriet was going to sleep in the big bedroom, and Charles had turned magnificently red and said that was a question for a different time, and Eli had apparently found this answer satisfying enough to go back to his drawing. The weeks that followed deepened into the winter of late 1882, and the ranch settled into the warmth of something that was being built. Not rushed, not forced, but built the way good things are built, carefully with the right materials, by people who have learned enough from past mistakes to know the value of doing it properly. She and Charles walked together in the evenings when the work was done, and the boys were inside, along the track that ran south toward the dry creek bed, and these walks were the center of something she could not quite describe, except that the word that kept coming to her was home. Not the ranch specifically, not New Mexico, not any place, but the particular quality of a person standing beside you in the cold dark, and the particular feeling of being completely known and completely accepted. He told her more about Alina on one of these walks. She would have liked you, he said. She wanted this house to have more life in it. She complained that I was too quiet. She was right, Harriet said. I know, he said. I know that now. He reached over and took her hand as they walked, the first time he had done anything so simple and so direct, and she felt the warmth of it spread up her arm and through her chest and settle somewhere she did not have a proper word for. I am going to ask you something important, he said. On Saturday, I am going to ask it properly. All right, she said, keeping her voice steady, which required effort. I wanted to warn you, he said, so that you could think about it beforehand, because you deserve to be able to think about everything. I do not want to be a man who puts you in positions where you cannot think. She squeezed his hand. Charles, yes. I have been thinking about it since approximately October. A pause. October, he was quiet. I was a fool. Yes, she agreed pleasantly, but a salvageable one. He laughed. She leaned slightly into his shoulder as they walked. The stars above New Mexico were the most extraordinary she had ever seen, so thick and close and white bright that on clear nights they gave the landscape a faint illumination, and she thought that if she had stayed in Philadelphia she would never have known this sky, and she was glad, profoundly and completely glad, that she had been brave enough to answer an advertisement in a newspaper. Saturday came with a cold, clear sky and a light that made the mountains look as though they had been cut from blue paper and pinned against the sky. Charles came to her in the kitchen at noon, formally dressed for a man who was staying home, coat brushed, boots cleaned. The boys were conspicuously absent, which meant they were conspicuously listening from somewhere they considered out of sight. He held out his hand and she put her hand in it. He said, Harriet Quinn, I'm not a man who is easy to live with or particularly natural at this, and you know that better than most because you have had months of evidence. But I love you. I have loved you since probably October, like a fool, without knowing how to say it. And I would like very much for you to be my wife. If you are willing, if you have decided to stay. She thought of the night she had cried in her room and said nobody wanted her. She thought of 2 small boys in a kitchen doorway asking for her name. She thought of 47 days of careful distance and 1 November conversation and wildflowers on a kitchen table and her hand in his in the cold dark. She thought of all of it, the whole tangled, complicated, beautiful whole of it. I have decided to stay, she said. And yes. The sound of 2 boys failing to be silent from behind the hallway wall was immediate and significant. Thomas appeared first, hat in hand, trying and failing to look like someone who had not been listening. Eli appeared at his shoulder, gap-toothed grin at full power. We are very pleased, Thomas announced. Yes, said Eli. Charles looked at them with the expression of a man who is exasperated and profoundly grateful in equal measure. Go outside, he said. They went. But Harriet could hear them on the porch, talking to each other in the particular tone of boys who are conducting a thorough review of recent events, and she laughed. And Charles was still holding her hand, and he raised it to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles in a gesture so formal and so tender that she thought her heart might not survive being this happy without some structural reinforcement. They were married in January of 1883 in the small church on the main street of Cimarron, on a morning of hard frost and thin, bright sunlight that turned everything to silver and white. Ruth and her husband made the journey from Philadelphia for the occasion. Ruth round and beautiful with the pregnancy that was nearly at term, her eyes wet from the moment she saw Harriet in the doorway of the church vestibule in the blue wool dress she had made herself from fabric Charles had brought back from the dry goods store in Springer. Sheriff Walters was there. The ranch's hired hand, a quiet Texan named Hobbs, stood in the back with his hat over his heart. Thomas stood beside his father as the best man, very straight, deeply serious, performing the role with a gravity that made half the congregation smile. Eli stood beside Thomas with a small bunch of dried yellow flowers that he had apparently been saving since November, which he produced at the right moment with the air of someone executing a plan that had been in place for quite some time. The preacher, a lean and practical man named Reverend Cross, read the service in the brisk December-style January air of the small church, and Charles Chandler said "I do" in a voice that was quiet and clear and steady as the mountains outside the window, and Harriet Quinn said "I do" in a voice that was all of those things plus something warm underneath, that the Reverend noted privately was one of the better expressions of the words he had heard in 20 years of performing this particular ceremony. Charles put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band he had ordered from Santa Fe weeks before he asked her, which she found later, and which made her love him even more for the deliberate confidence of it. He kissed her with great dignity and very real feeling, and the small congregation applauded, and Ruth cried openly, and Thomas permitted himself a full real smile, which on a Chandler face was practically a standing ovation. After the wedding there was a supper at the hotel, a real celebration organized by Mrs. Morrison from the general store, who had apparently decided that the Chandler Ranch having a proper wife in it was the best news to come through Cimarron in several years, and had acted accordingly with an enthusiasm that expressed itself in 3 different pies and 2 kinds of cake. People came. The town was small but close-knit in the way of frontier towns where everyone's fortunes were bound up with everyone else's, and Charles Chandler was known as a good man and a fair neighbor, and his new wife was received with a warmth that told Harriet more about the kind of place she had come to than any single thing that had happened before. She danced with Charles once, in the cleared center of the hotel dining room, the fiddler from across the street playing something slow enough for 2 people who were not expert dancers, and she was close enough to smell the cold winter air still on his coat and feel the solid warmth of him through the fabric. And she thought she had been exactly right to leave Philadelphia, and that fate or providence or simple desperate longing had done her an extraordinary favor by putting that newspaper in her hands at that particular table in that particular kitchen. They rode home in the moonlit cold, the 4 of them, Charles driving and Harriet beside him on the seat, and the boys wrapped in blankets in the back of the wagon, Eli asleep against Thomas's shoulder before they were 2 miles out of town. The stars were out in their full New Mexico extravagance, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky that was the deep blue-black of very cold air, and the horse's breath steamed white in the lamplight. Charles put his arm around her on the wagon seat without looking at her, a simple, unhurried movement, pulling her in against his side against the cold, and she let herself lean into him, and for a long time neither of them said anything, and the wagon moved through the dark and the cold and the enormous quiet of the country, and the ranch lights appeared ahead of them as they rounded the last bend, warm and steady in the dark. "Welcome home," Charles said. She had never heard 2 words that fit so perfectly. The first year of their marriage was the year she learned what it meant to truly love a place. She had liked New Mexico before. She had found it beautiful in the formal way of things that are impressive, but not yet intimate. But that first year, working the house and the kitchen garden and teaching the boys and learning the rhythms of the land through Charles's patient explanations and her own accumulating experience, she fell in love with it in the way you fall in love with a place only when it has started to carry your own history, when your footprints are in its soil, and your breath has been part of its air, and your joys and sorrows have happened against its specific light. She learned to ride, a project that Charles undertook with a seriousness that she found both touching and mildly hilarious, presenting her with a steady bay mare named Clara, and instructing her with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. Thomas supervised from the fence post with critical commentary that she eventually told him was helpful, which made him simultaneously proud and embarrassed, which was her favorite combination of Thomas expressions. She wrote to Ruth every week without fail and received news in return. Ruth's baby was born in February, a boy they named Henry, and the letters became full of the particular exhausted joy of new parents, and Harriet read them with her own chest full of something sweet and complicated that she did not yet say out loud. It was April when she told Charles. A Sunday evening, the boys in bed, the house warm with the fire she had built against the April cold that still came down from the mountains at night. She told him simply, because she was learning that the things that mattered most were best said directly. He sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up from his chair and crossed the room and put his arms around her, and she felt the careful, fierce quality of the embrace, a man who loves you and has been reminded of what he is afraid to lose, and she held him back just as hard. "We will be all right," she told him. "I know," he said, but he held on another moment. Their son was born in December of 1883, on a cold and starry night that felt to Harriet in retrospect like the conclusion of something that had been building since the day she stepped off the stagecoach in Cimarron. He was healthy and loud, and had his father's blue eyes and her own dark hair, and Charles held him with the terrified and reverent expression of a man receiving something he does not feel he deserves, but is fiercely, unconditionally grateful for. Thomas and Eli were brought in the morning, Thomas with his composure firmly in place, until he saw the baby and briefly lost it in a way he recovered from very quickly and never spoke of. Eli held the baby for almost 10 minutes, studying his face with the focused attention he brought to everything he wanted to understand, and said finally that he was going to draw a picture of him, which became the first of many drawings. A series of the baby's face as he grew that would, over the following years, constitute a remarkable record of one small person's passage through time. They named him William. Will in daily use, or Willie when Eli was feeling sentimental, which was often. Charles was different after Will was born, not transformed, not suddenly unburdened of everything he carried, but different in the way a man is different when he has looked at a new life and found that the thing inside him he had been afraid to open can, in fact, open without destroying him. He was more present. He laughed more often, the real laugh she had been cataloging, and it became less rare and more ordinary, which was the most wonderful thing about it. He also, in a conversation she returned to for years afterward, sat down with Thomas one evening in the spring of 1884 and told him, man to man as much as was possible between a 43-year-old and a 13-year-old, that he was sorry he had been a locked door for so many years. That Thomas had deserved more of him than he had been capable of giving in the years after Alina died, that he was trying to do better and that he hoped Thomas knew how much he was loved. Thomas listened to all of this without speaking. Then he said, "I know, Father," in a voice that was steady and a little thick. And then he said, "Harriet helped." Charles looked at the door to the kitchen where Harriet was presumably out of earshot and said, "Yes, she did." And Harriet, who was in fact entirely within earshot, stood very still at the kitchen counter with her hands flat on the wood and felt something complete. The spring of 1884 also brought word from Philadelphia that Frank Delaney had been brought up on fraud charges in connection with a failed investment scheme, details of which Ruth relayed in a letter with considerable satisfaction. He had apparently been engaged in the same patterns of behavior with a number of people over a number of years, and the accumulated weight of it had finally caught up with him. He was facing serious legal consequences. The letters Harriet had written him would never be needed. She read this to Charles over breakfast on a Tuesday morning, and he listened and said, "Good," in the simple, definitive tone of a man closing a chapter. That is all you have to say." She asked, "What else is there to say?" He passed her the bread. "It is done," she laughed. "You are the most unsentimental man I have ever met. You married me anyway." "I have always been susceptible to a challenge," she said. He smiled at her across the table, that smile she had catalogued on a November evening and had been adding to the catalogue ever since, and it was still, a year and a half after she first saw it, the best thing she had seen in New Mexico, and that was a high bar. The ranch grew in those years. Charles added stock. He hired 2 more hands. The kitchen garden became a real garden under Harriet's care, and the addition of a proper irrigation channel that Charles built with the assistance of a neighboring rancher, an irrigation method she had read about in an agricultural journal that Charles had subscribed to, partly at her suggestion, and partly because he was a man who could be persuaded by evidence. They got a milk cow. Eli named her Martha and refused to participate in any conversation about her practical value. Thomas turned 14 in 1884 and had by then become a fixture on the ranch in the full working sense, managing the morning feeding with a competence that Charles acknowledged by starting to consult him on livestock decisions with the naturalness of a man who has realized his son is ready. Thomas received this as his due, because he had been expecting it for at least 2 years, but the pleasure in his eyes was real and unguarded. Eli at 10 had discovered that his drawing ability extended to mathematics in a visual way that Harriet recognized as a specific kind of geometric intelligence. She began teaching him accordingly, adjusting the lessons to his particular way of seeing, and the results were striking. He solved problems by drawing them, constructing diagrams that arrived at correct answers by routes that were unconventional and completely valid. She wrote a long letter about it to a former teacher of hers in Philadelphia, who wrote back with genuine interest. The winter of 1884 brought the second letter from Harriet to her sister that contained news of importance. Ruth, who was by now an experienced reader of Harriet's letters, immediately detected the shift in tone and wrote back with a single line at the top of her usual letter. "Are you expecting again?" And Harriet had laughed out loud at the kitchen table and written back a single line, "Yes, due in June." Ruth sent 3 pages in reply. The second pregnancy was different from the first, easier in some physical respects and more complicated in the emotional ones, because she was older now and more aware of what was at stake, and because Charles's fear, which had never fully gone away, was more present this time, showing itself in small ways that she addressed by being very direct with him about the fact that she was healthy, and the doctor said everything was proceeding normally, which did not fully reassure him but which he appreciated as a statement of fact. Dr. Patterson, who had been Cimarron's physician for 15 years and had delivered more babies than he could accurately count, told Charles with the brisk reassurance of a man who has dealt with anxious fathers before that Miss Harriet was a healthy woman, and that he was quite confident the delivery would go smoothly. Charles thanked him and went home and read through 3 separate agricultural journals in one evening, which was his equivalent of pacing. The baby was born on a June morning when the New Mexico sky was the particular shade of blue that Harriet had come to think of as the truest blue that existed anywhere, a blue that had no gray in it, a blue that looked like freedom. The baby was a girl. She was born with Harriet's hair and Charles's eyes, and an immediate and decisive personality that made itself known within the first hour through the simple expedient of screaming until she was held, and then stopping, and looking around the room with an expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and is taking inventory. Charles held her the way he had held Will, with the terrified reverence of a man who knows the value of what he is holding. Harriet watched him from the bed, exhausted and complete, and thought that this was one of the sights she would keep, the way you keep certain things against the general wear of time. They named her a leaner. Not to replace or to mourn, but to honor in the way that the dead are best honored, by being carried forward into the living world rather than sealed away from it. Charles said the name the night they decided it, slowly and with great care, and then looked at Harriet with an expression that asked whether she was entirely sure, and she reached for his hand and said yes, she was entirely sure. Thomas said it was a good name. Eli immediately began a new section of his journal, Eleanor's pages. Will, who was 1.5 and in possession of a vocabulary that was more enthusiastic than precise, called his sister Nella for the first 8 months of her existence, which turned out to be the name that stuck. Eleanor Nella Chandler, who grew into a girl of extraordinary will and Charles's exact shade of blue eyes, and who from her earliest months had a habit of studying people with a focused intensity that made her look, in certain lights, exactly like her father. The years turned. Thomas turned 17 in 1887 and began to talk about the possibility of his own land, his own start, the way young men do when they are ready to move from being someone's son to being someone's equal. Charles listened to these conversations with the careful attention of a man who knows that this is right even when it is hard, and Harriet watched them have these conversations from across rooms and tables and porch railings. And she thought there was nothing more like love than watching a good man let his son become himself. Eli, 15 in 1887, had been corresponding with Harriet's former Philadelphia teacher, a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who had recognized in Eli's drawings and described mathematical observations something worth cultivating. The letters were long and technical in ways that increasingly outpaced Harriet's own knowledge, which she told Eli with complete honesty and a deep pride that had nothing of disappointment in it. "You are," she told him, "going to need better teachers than me. This is the best possible problem to have." She and Charles had this conversation about Eli and about what his particular kind of intelligence might need. On a warm autumn evening in 1887, sitting on the front porch of the ranch house with the sun going down behind the mountains in the extravagant New Mexico fashion, all orange and rose and gold, Will running in the yard chasing a dog that had attached itself to the ranch the previous spring, Nella sitting in Charles's lap pulling very seriously on the button of his shirt pocket. "We could look at the school in Santa Fe," Harriet said. "The one that Mrs. Alcott mentioned. It is expensive, but we are not without resources." "He won't want to go," Charles said. "He will want to go when he understands what he will get from it," she said. "He just needs to see the evidence. He is exactly like you that way." Charles looked at her with the expression she had learned to call his most honest expression, the one with no performance in it. "You know us very well," he said. "I have been paying attention for 5 years," she said. He shifted Nella slightly on his lap and reached over and took Harriet's hand on the arm of the porch chair, the same simple, unhurried movement he had made on the wagon seat on their wedding night. And she thought that some things do not change and do not need to, that the best things become more themselves with time rather than less, and that this man beside her with his daughter on his knee and his son running in the yard was more completely himself than he had been on any of those careful November evenings. And she loved him more for all of it, for the opening of it, for the long, patient work of it. "I want to tell you something," Charles said. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment in the old way, the way of a man gathering his words, but it was different now, the quietness. It was not sealed. It was just the particular thoroughness of a man who does not speak until he is sure of what he is saying. "I think about the night you said you had made a terrible mistake," he said. "Thomas told me about it eventually. He told me he heard you through the wall." He paused. "I think about it because I know it was my fault. Because I was locked and I was afraid and I let you feel like something you weren't." "Charles," she said. "I know we are past it," he said quickly. "I'm not telling you because I think you need to hear an apology now, after 5 years of what we have had. I am telling you because I think about it when I am grateful, which is often. Because I need you to know that I am grateful every single day that Thomas went through that kitchen door and asked you for your name." She looked at the side of his face, at the jaw that had once been utterly unreadable to her, and was now a landscape she knew as well as her own hands. She looked at the way the evening light sat on him, gold and honest, the way New Mexico light sat on everything, without mercy and without flattery. "He asked if he could call me Harriet," she said. "He did," Charles said. "And you let him." "I did. And then you stayed." "I did." He turned to look at her then, fully, the blue eyes and the long worn face and the warmth behind it that had been there all along, the whole time, waiting to be seen. "I am going to be grateful for that," he said, "for the rest of my life." She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, soft and certain, and he turned and kissed her back properly. And Nella said "Papa" in an accusatory tone and grabbed his chin. And they both laughed. And Will shrieked something across the yard at the dog, and the mountains went rose and gold behind them. And the evening settled around the Chandler ranch the way evenings in the right place settle, complete and warm and entirely at rest. Eli went to the school in Santa Fe in the spring of 1888, which was not easy for any of them and was exactly right for him, as Harriet had predicted. He came home in the summers. He wrote letters every week, long letters full of what he was learning, and he drew the cities and the buildings and the faces he saw with the same devoted accuracy he had always brought to everything. And in his letters to Harriet, he was more open than he was in person, more honest about his feelings, more willing to say the difficult things, and she treasured every word and kept them in a box in the top of the wardrobe. Thomas, at 18 in 1888, filed a homestead claim on a section of land 4 miles east of his father's property, land that ran along the same dry creek and shared a fence line with the Chandler Ranch, close enough to visit easily and far enough to be his own. Charles rode the fence line with him on the morning he filed the claim, and they were out for most of the day. And when they came back in the evening, Charles's face had the expression she had seen the night Will was born, that opened, undefended, almost fragile quality of a man who is feeling something too large for his normal register. She did not ask him about it that evening. She simply made supper and set the table, and when he came to the table and sat down and looked at her, she said, "How was the ride?" "Good," he said, and then in the simple direct way that was entirely him, "He is going to be fine." "Yes," she agreed, "he is." "You helped make that," he said. "We all made it together," she said. They ate supper, the 4 of them, Charles and Harriet and Will and Nella, and the spaces at the table that would have been Thomas's and Eli's were present as absences that were not empty but full, full of the shapes of 2 people who had gone out into the world, carrying everything the Chandler table had given them. Will was 5 in 1888 and in the beginning of his lessons, which he approached with a different energy from either Thomas or Eli, less systematic than Thomas, less visual than Eli, more verbal, more social. The child who asked why about everything and who had at age 4 begun an interrogation of the natural world that suggested he was going to keep asking until he had answers about everything, which Harriet found both exhausting and completely wonderful. Nella was 3 and was currently in the phase of development where she was testing the exact limits of every rule and relationship in her life, which she did with the focused efficiency of an engineer, and which Charles navigated with a patience that Harriet found deeply funny, because Nella had discovered quite early that she could manage her father in ways she could not manage her mother. And she deployed this knowledge with a calculation that was frankly impressive in someone who could not yet read. The Christmas of 1888 was the last one before the decade turned, and they made it a real celebration. Eli came home from Santa Fe, taller by an inch, and with a new hat he had purchased with his own money, very pleased with himself. Thomas rode over from his place on Christmas morning with a bottle of whiskey for Charles and a ribbon for Nella that he had apparently purchased at considerable expense for a 20-year-old with a new homestead. Ruth and her husband and young Henry, now 6, made the journey from Philadelphia for the occasion, which had become something of a tradition in recent years, and the house was full in a way it had not been in all the years she had lived there. They ate and they talked, and the children ran through the house, and Charles and Ruth's husband sat together on the porch in the cold, and discussed cattle prices and city commerce respectively, with the mutual respect of men who acknowledge each other's competence without fully understanding it. And Harriet and Ruth sat in the kitchen and talked with the ease of women who have been writing letters to each other for 6 years, and find that the person on the other side of the letters is, in real life, even better. "You look," Ruth said, studying her sister across the kitchen table with the unsparing affection of a sibling, "extraordinarily well." "I am extraordinarily well," Harriet said. Ruth smiled the smile of a woman who was right and has been right and will not say so because she does not need to, because the evidence is sitting across from her in a kitchen in New Mexico looking happier than she has ever looked, which is sufficient. "Gerald Winslow married a woman from Connecticut," she mentioned. "I know," Harriet said. "You told me in your letter. I wanted to see your face." "And absolutely nothing," Ruth said with satisfaction. "You have no reaction whatsoever." "None," Harriet agreed. "Good," said Ruth. On Christmas evening, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet in the way it goes quiet when it is very full and very warm and very loved, Harriet and Charles sat by the fire in the sitting room with the last of the year's candles burning on the table, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the fire went soft and gold, and the New Mexico night pressed cold against the windows. And she thought about a Tuesday in August in 1882, when she stepped off a stagecoach into the heat, and a man she did not yet know loaded her trunk into his wagon and drove her 9 miles in silence and introduced her to 2 small boys who would call her ma'am until they asked for something better. She thought about how frightened she had been and how much she had wanted and how hard she had worked not to want it because wanting it had seemed dangerous. She thought about the night she cried in her room, and the morning 2 boys came to the kitchen door and changed everything by asking a simple, profound, irreversible question. She thought about what it meant that love, the real and lasting kind, sometimes began not with a grand gesture but with a name. With 2 boys learning to say a woman's name like it belonged to her, with a woman deciding because of it to stay. "What are you thinking?" Charles asked. "About Harriet," she said. He looked at her. "You are thinking about yourself. About the name," she said. "About the first time your son said it, about how I did not know then what that moment was." He was quiet for a moment in the warm, unhurried way. "What was it?" he asked. She thought about it. "The beginning," she said. "It was the beginning." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head and held her a little more firmly against his side. And the fire burned on. And outside the New Mexico stars were doing what they always did over that country, burning so bright and close and numberless that the dark between them was only a detail. And the ranch house sat in all of that starlight and dark like something settled and permanent and real, full of the breathing of sleeping children and the warmth of 2 people who had found their way to each other through all the fear and the silence and the sealed and careful and eventually opened rooms of the human heart. In the years after, when people asked Harriet how she had come to be in New Mexico, she would tell them the practical story. She would tell them about the advertisement and the letters and the stagecoach and the 9 miles. She told it simply, without decoration, because it was a true story and true stories do not need decoration. But in her own private accounting of it, the one she returned to when she thought about the shape of her life, the story always began in the same place, not in Philadelphia, not on the stagecoach, not in the 9-mile silence or the first supper at the long table, or even the November night in the kitchen when Charles Chandler finally said out loud the things he had been thinking for months. The story always began in a kitchen on an October evening with a wooden spoon in her hand and 2 boys in the doorway, and one of them, 12 years old, hat in his hands, looking at her with his father's eyes and asking permission to use her name. Not ma'am, Harriet. Her name, the one that belonged to her. That was it. That was everything. That was where it started. And from there it had gone, steadily and inevitably and beautifully, exactly where it was always meant to go.